Imelda by Richard Slezer. I heard the other day that Hugh Franciscus had died. I knew him once. He was the chief of plastic surgery when I was a medical student at Albany Medical College. Dr. Franciscus was the archetype of the professor of surgery, tall, vigorous, muscular, as precise in his technique as he was impeccable in his dress. Each day a clean lab coat monkishly starched, that sort of thing. I doubt that he ever read books. One book only, that of the human body, took the place of all others. He never raised his eyes from it. He read it like a printed page, as though he never knew that in the calligraphy, there just beneath the skin, were all the secrets of the world. Long before it became visible to anyone else, he could detect the first sign of granulation at the base of a wound, the first blue line of a new epithelium of the periphery that would tell him that a wound would heal, or the barest hint of necrosis that presaged failure. This gave him the appearance of a prophet. The skin graft will take, he would say, and you must believe beyond all kenosis, exudation, and inflammation that it would. He had enemies, of course, who said that he was arrogant, that he was exalted activity for its own sake, perhaps, but perhaps it was no more than the honesty of one who knows his own worth. Just look at a scalpel, after all. What a feeling of sovereignty, melanoma even, when you know that it is you, and you alone, who will make certain use of it. That was said, too, that he was a ladies' man. I don't know about that. It was all rumor. Besides, I think he had other things in mind than mere living. Hugh Franciscus was a zealous hunter. Every fall during the season, he drove upstate to hunt deer. There was a glass front case in his office where he showed us guns. How could he shoot a deer? We asked. But he knew better. To us medical students, he was someone heroic, someone made up of several gods, beheld at a distance, and always from a lesser height. If he had grown accustomed to his miracles, we had not. He had no close friends on the staff. There was something a little sad in that, as though once long ago he had been flayed by friendship, and now the slightest breeze would hurt. Confidences resulted in dishonor. Perhaps the person in whom one confided would scorn him, betray. Even though he spent his days among those less fortunate, weaker than he, the sick after all, Franciscus seemed aware of an air of personal harshness in his environment, to which he reacted by keeping his own counsel by certain remoteness. It was what gave him the appearance of being haughty. With the patients he was forthright, all the facts laid out, every question anticipated and answered with specific information. He delivered good news and bad with the same disposition. I was a third-year student, just turned into the ward for the first time, and clerking on surgery. Everything, the operating room, the morgue, the emergency room, the patients, professors, even the nurses, was terrifying. One picked one's way among the mines and booby traps of the hospital, hoping only to avoid the hemorrhage and preparation of disgrace. The opportunity for humiliation was everywhere. It all began on ward rounds. Dr. Franciscus was demonstrating a cross-leg flap graft he had constructed to cover a large fleshy defect in the leg of a merchant seaman who had injured himself in the fall. The man was from Spain and spoke no English. There had been a comminuted fracture of the femur, much soft tissue damage, and necrosis. After weeks of debridement and dressings, the wound had been made ready for grafting. Now the patient was in his fifth post-operative day. What we saw was a thick web of pale blue flesh arising from the man's left thigh, which had been sutured to the open wound on the right thigh. When the surgeon pressed the pedicle with his finger, it blanched. When he let up, there was a slow return of the violaceous color. The circulation is good, Franciscus announced. It will get better. In several weeks, we were told, he would divide the tube of flesh at its site of origin and tailor it to fit the defect to which by then it would have grown more solidly. All at once, the webbed man in the bed reached out and, gripping Franciscus by the arm, began to speak rapidly, pointing to his groin and hip. Franciscus stepped back at once to disengage his arm from the patient's grasp. Anyone here know Spanish? I didn't get a word of that. The cast is digging into him up above, I said. The edges of the plaster are rough. When he moves, they hurt. Without acknowledging my assistance, Dr. Franciscus took a plaster shears from the dressing cart and with several large snips cut away the rough edges of the cast. Gracias, gracias. The man on the bed smiled, but Franciscus had already moved on to the next bed. He seemed to be a man of immense strength and ability, yet without affection for the patients. He did not want to be touched by them. It was less kindness that he showed them than a reassurance that he would never give up, that he would bend every effort. If anyone could, he would solve the problems of their flesh. Ward rounds had disbanded, and I was halfway down the corridor when I heard Dr. Franciscus's voice behind me. "You speak Spanish," it seemed a command. I lived in Spain for 2 years, I told him. I'm taking a surgical team to Honduras next week to operate on the natives down there. I do it every year for 3 weeks, somewhere. This year, Honduras. I can arrange the time away from your duties here if you'd like to come along. You act as interpreter. I'll show you how to use the clinical camera. What you'd see would make it worthwhile. So it was that. A week later, the envy of my classmates, I joined the mobile surgical unit, surgeons, anesthesiasts, nurses, and equipment aboard a military air transport plane to spend 3 weeks performing plastic surgery on people who had been previously selected by an advanced team. Honduras. I don't suppose I shall ever see it again, nor do I especially want to. From the plane it seemed a country made of clay, burnt umber, raw sienna dry. It had a dead weight quality, as though the ground had no buoyancy, no air sacs through which a breeze might wander. Our destination was Kumayagua, a town in the central highlands. The town itself was situated on the edge of one of the flatlands that were linked to a network between granite mountains. Above all was brown, with only an occasional Spanish cedar tree. Below, patches of luxuriant tropical growth. It was a day's bus ride from the airport. For hours, the town kept appearing and disappearing with the convolutions of the road. At last, kept appear. At last, there it lay before us, panting and exhausted at the bottom of the mountain. That was all I was to see of the countryside. From then on, there was only the derelict hospital of Comayagua, with the smell of spoiling bananas and the accumulated odors of everyone who had been sick there for the last 100 years. Of the two, I much preferred the frank smell of the sick. The heat of the place was incendiary, so hot that as we stepped from the bus, our own words did not carry through the air, but hung limply at our lips and chins. Just in front of the hospital was a thirsty courtyard where mobs of waiting people squatted or lay in the meager shade, and where on dry days a fine dust rose through which untethered goats shouldered. Against the walls of this courtyard, gaunt, dejected men stood, their faces like their country, preternality solemn laden. Here no one looked up at the sky. Every head was bent beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat. In the days that followed, from the doorway of the dispensary, I would watch the brown mountains sliding about, drinking the hospital into their shadow as the afternoon grew later and later, flattening us by their very altitude. The people were mestizos, a mix of Spanish and Indian blood. They had flat, broad, dumb museum feet. At first they seemed to me indistinguishable the one from the other, without animation. All the vitality, the hidden sexuality was in their black hair. Soon I was to know them by the fissures with which each face was graven. But even so, compared to us, they are masked, shut away. My job was to follow Dr. Franciscus around, photograph the patients before and after surgery, interpret and generally act as aide de camp. It was exhilarating. Within days, I had decided that I was not just useful, but essential. Despite that we spent all day in each other's company, there was no overtures of friendship from Dr. Franciscus. He knew my place, and I knew it too. In the afternoon, he examined the patient's schedule for the next day's surgery. I would call out a name from the doorway to the examining room. In the courtyard, someone would rise. I would usher the patient in and nudge them to the examining table where Franciscus stood. Always, I thought, on the verge of irritability. I would read aloud the case history, and then wait while he carried out his examination. While I took the before photographs, Dr. Franciscus would dictate into a tape recorder. Euclerating basal cell carcinoma on the right orbit, 6 by 8 centimeters, involving the right eye and extending onto the floor of the orbit. Operative plan. Wide excision with enucleation of the eye, later bone and skin grafting. The next morning, we would be in the operating room where the procedure would be carried out. We are more than 2 weeks into our tour of duty, a few days to go when it happened. Earlier in the day, I'd caught sight of her through the window of the dispensary, a thin, dark Indian girl about 14 years old, a figurine, orange-brown terracotta and still attached to the unshapely clay from which she had been carved. An older, sun-weathered woman stood behind, from somewhat to the left of the girl. The mother was short and dumpy. She wore a broad-brimmed hat with a high crown and a shapeless dress like a cassock. The girl had long, loose black hair. There were tiny gold hoops in her ears. The dress she wore could have been her mother's, far too big. It hung from her thin shoulder at some risk of slipping down her arms. Even with her in it, the dress was empty, something hanging on the back of a door. Her breasts made only the smallest imprint in the cloth, her hips none at all. All the while she pressed to her mouth a filthy, pink, balled-up rag as though to staunch a flow or buttress against pain. I knew that what she had come to show us, what we were there to see, was hidden beneath that pink cloth. As I watched, the woman handed down to her a gourd from which the girl drank, lapping like a dog. She was the last patient of the day. They had been waiting in the courtyard for hours. Imelda Valdez, I called out. Slowly, as she rose to her feet, the cloth never leaving her mouth, and followed her mother to the examining room door. I shooed them in. You sit there on the table, I told her. Mother, you stand over there, please. I read from the chart. This is a 14-year-old girl with a complete unilateral left-sided cleft lip and cleft palate. No other diseases or congenital defects. Laboratory tests, chest, X-ray negative. Tell her to take the rag away, said Dr. Franciscus. I did, and the girl shrank back, pressing the cloth all the more firmly. Listen, this is silly, said Franciscus. Tell her I've got to see it. Either she behaves or send her away. Please give me the cloth, I said to the girl as gently as possible. She did not. She could not. Just then, Franciscus reached up and, taking the hand that held the rag, pulled it away with a hard jerk. For an instant, the girl's head followed the cloth as it left her face, one arm still upflung against showing. Against all hope, she would hide herself. A moment later, she relaxed and sat still. She seemed to me then like an animal that looks outward at the infinite, a death without fear, with recognition only. Set as it was at the center of the girl's face, the defect was utterly hideous. A nude, rubbery insect that had fastened there. The upper lip was widely split all the way to the nose. One white tooth perched upon the protruding upper jaw, projected through the hole. Some of the bones seemed to have been gnawed away as well. Above the thing, clear almond eyes and long black hair reflected the light. Below a slender neck where the pulse trilled visibly. Under our gaze, the girl's eyes fell to her lap, where her hands lay palms upward, half open. She was a beautiful bird with a crushed beak, and tense with the expectation of more shame. Open your mouth, said the surgeon. I translated. She did so, and the surgeon tipped back her head to see inside. The palate, too, complete. She said. There was a long silence. At last he spoke. What is your name? The margin of the wound melted until she herself was being sucked into it. Imelda. The syllables leaked through the holes with a slosh and a whistle. Tomorrow, said the surgeon, I will fix your lip. Mañana. It seemed to me that Hugh Franciscus, in spite of his years of experience, in spite of all the dreadful things he had seen, must have been awed by the sight of this girl. It could see, I could see it flit across his face for an instant. Perhaps it was her small act of concealment that he had to demand that she show him the lip, that he had to force her to show it to him. Perhaps it was her resistance that intensified the disfigurement. Had she brought her mouth to him willingly, without shame, she would have been for him neither more nor less than any other patient. He measured the defect with calipers, studied it from different angles, turning her head with a finger at her chin. How can it ever be put back together? I asked. Take her picture, he said, and to her. Look straight ahead. Through the eye of the camera, she seemed more pitiful than ever, her humiliation more complete. Wait, the surgeon stopped me. I lowered the camera. A strand of her hair had fallen across her face and found its way into her mouth, becoming stuck there by saliva. He removed the hair and secured it behind her ear. Go ahead, he ordered. There was a click of the camera. The girl winced. Take 3 more, just in case. When the girl and her mother had left, he took paper and pen, and with a few lines drew a remarkable likeness of the girl's face. Look, he said, if this dot is A, and this one B, this C, and this D, the incisions are made A to B, then C to D. CD must equal AB. It is all equilateral triangles. All well and good, but then came X and Y, and rotation flaps and the rest. Do you see? He asked. It is confusing, I told him. It is simply a matter of dropping the upper lip into a normal position, then crossing the gap with 2 triangular flaps. It is geometry, he said. Yes, I said, geometry, and relinquished all hope of becoming a plastic surgeon. In the operating room the next morning, the anesthesia had already been administered when we arrived from ward rounds. The tube emerging from the girl's mouth was pressed against her lower lip to be kept out of the field of surgery. Already a nurse was scrubbing the face, which swam in a reddish-brown lather. The tiny gold earrings were included in the scrub. Now and then one of them gave a brave flash. The face was washed for the last time and dried. Green towels were placed over the face to hide everything but the mouth and nose. The drapes were applied. Calipers, the surgeon measured, locating the peak of the distorted cupid's bow. Marking pen. He placed the first blue dot at the apex of the bow. The nasal sills were dotted. Next, the inferior filtral dimple, the vermilion line. The A flap and the B flap were outlined. On he worked, peppering the lip and nose, making sense out of chaos. Realizing that the last lip now lay waiting in that deep essential pink that only he could see. The last dot and line were placed. He was ready. Scalpel. He held the knife above the girl's mouth. Okay to go ahead? He asked the anesthesiast. Yes. He lowered the knife. No, wait. The anesthesiast's voice was tense. Staccato. Hold it. The surgeon's hand was motionless. What's the matter? Something's wrong. I'm not sure. She's hot as a pistol. Blood pressure's way up. Pulse 180. Get her rectal temperature. A nurse fumbled beneath the drapes. We waited. The nurse retrieved the thermometer. 107. No, 8. There was disbelief in her voice. Malignant hypothermia, said the anesthesiast. Ice, ice, gets lots of ice. I raced out the door, accosted by the first nurse I saw. Ice, I shouted. Helio, quickly, Helio. The woman's expression was blank. I ran to another. Helio, Helio. Ice. Helio, she shrugged. Nada. I ran back to the operating room. There isn't any ice, I reported. Dr. Franciscus's had ripped off his rubber glove and feeling the skin of the girl's abdomen. Above the mask, his eyes were the eyes of a horse in battle. The EKG is wild. I can't get a pulse. What the heck? The surgeon reached for the girl's groin. No femoral pulse. EKG flat. She's dead. She can't be. She is. The surgeon's finger pressed the groin where there was no pulse to be felt. Only his own pulse hammering at the girl's flesh should be let in. It was noon. 4 hours later, when we left the operating room, it was a day so hot and humid I felt steamed open like an envelope. The woman was sitting on a bench in the courtyard in her dress like a cassock. In one hand, she held the piece of cloth the girl had used to conceal her mouth. As we watched it, she folded it neatly, and then again, smoothing it, cleaning the cloth which might have been the head of the girl and that her lap that she stroked and concealed. I'll do the talking here, he said. He would tell her himself in whatever Spanish he could find, only if she did not understand that I was to speak for him. I watched him brace himself, set his shoulders. How could he tell her? I wondered what. But I knew he would tell her everything exactly as it had happened. As much for himself as for her, he needed to explain. But suppose he screamed, fell to the ground, attacked him even. All that hope of love gone. Even in his discomfort, I knew that he was teaching me. The way to do it was professionally. Now he was standing above her. When the woman saw that he did not speak, she lifted her eyes and saw what he held crammed in his mouth to tell her. She knew and rose to her feet. Senora, he began, I am sorry. All at once he seemed to me shorter than he was, scarcely taller than she. There was a place at the crown of his head where his hair had grown thin. His lips were stones. He could hardly move them. The voice dry, dusty. No one could have known, for some bad reaction to the medicine for sleeping. It poisoned her. High fever. She did not wake up. The last, a whisper. The woman studied his lips as though she were deaf. He tried, but could not control a twitching at the corner of his mouth. He raised a thumb and forefinger to press something back into his eyes. Muerte, the woman announced to herself. Her eyes were human, deadly. Si, muerte. At that moment he was someone cast, still alive, as an effigy for his own tomb. He closed his eyes, nor did he open them until he felt the touch of the woman's hand on his arm, a touch from which he did not withdraw. Then he looked and saw the grief corroding her face, breaking it down, melting the features so that eyes, nose, mouth ran together in a distortion, like the girl's. For a long time they stood in silence. It seemed to me that minutes passed. At last her face cleared, the features rearranged themselves. She spoke, the words coming slowly to make certain that he understood her. She would go home now. The next day her sons would come for the girl, to take her home for burial. The doctor must not be sad. God has decided, and she was happy now that her hair lip had been fixed so that her daughter might go to heaven without it. Her bare feet retreating were the felted pads of a great bare-fed animal. The next morning I did not go to the wards, but stood at the gate leading from the courtyard to the road outside. Two young men in striped ponchos lifted the girl's body wrapped in a straw mat onto the back of a wooden cart. A donkey waited. I had been drawn to this place as once as one is drawn, inexplicitly, to certain scenes of desolation, executions, battlefields. All at once the woman looked up and saw me. She had taken off her hat. The heavy hanging coil of her hair made her head seem larger, darker, noble. I pressed some money into her hand. For flowers, I said, a priest. Her cheeks shook as though minutes ago a stone had been dropped into her navel and the ripples were just now reaching her head. I regretted having come to that place. See, the woman said. Her own face was stitched with flies. The doctor is one of the angels. He had finished the work of God. My daughter is beautiful. What could she mean? The lip had not been fixed. The girl had died before he would have done it. Only a fine line that God will erase in time, she said. I reached into the cart and lifted a corner of the mat in which the girl had been rolled. Where the cleft had been there was now a fresh line of tiny sutures. The cupid's bow was delicately shaped, the vermilion border aligned. The flattened nostril had now the same rounded shape as the other one. I let the mat fall over the face of the dead girl, but not before I had seen the touching place where the finest black hair sprang from the temple. Adios, adios, and the car creaked away to the sound of hooves, a tiny tinkling bell. There are events in the doctor's life that seem to mark the boundary between youth and age, seeing and perceiving. Like certain dreams, they illuminate a whole lifetime of past behavior. After such an event, a doctor is not the same as he was before. It seemed to me to then have the act of someone demented or at least insanely arrogant. An attempt to reorder events. Her death had come to him out of order. It should have come after the lip had been repaired, not before. He could have told the mother that, no, the lip had not been fixed, but he did not. He said nothing. It had been an act of omission, one of those strange lapses to which all of us are subject and which we live to regret. It must have been then, at that moment, that the knowledge of what he would do appeared to him. The words of the mother had not consoled him. They had hunted him down. He had not done it for her. The dire necessity was his. He would not accept that Imelda had died before he could repair her lip. People who do such things break free from society. They follow their own lonely path. They have a secret which they can never reveal. I must never let on that I knew. How often I have imagined it. 10 o'clock at night, the hospital in Comayagua is all but dark. Here and there, lanterns tilt and skitter up and down the corridors. One of these lamps break free from the others and descend the stone step to the underground room that is the morgue of the hospital. This room wears the expression as if it had waited all night for someone to come. No silence so deep at this place with its cargo of newly dead. Only the slow drip of water over a stone. The door closes ghastly and clicks shut. The lock is turned. There are 4 tables, each with a body encased in a paper shroud. There is no mistaking her. She is the smallest. The surgeon takes a knife from his pocket and slits open the paper shroud, the part in which the girl's head is enclosed. The wound seems to be living on long after she had died. Waves of heat emanate from it, blurring his vision. All at once he turns to peer over his shoulder. He sees nothing, only a wooden crucifix on the wall. He removes a package of instruments from a satchel and arranges them on a tray. Scalpel, scissors, forceps, needle holder, sutures and gauze sponges are produced. Stealthily, haunched, engaged, he begins. The dots of blue dye are still there upon her mouth. He raises the scalpel, pauses. A second glance into the darkness. From the wall, a small lizard watches and accepts. The first cut is made. A sluggish flow of dark blood appears. He wipes it away with a sponge. No new blood comes to take its place. Again and again he cuts, connecting each of the blue dots until the whole of the zigzag slice is made, first on one side of the cleft and then on the other. Now the edges of the cleft are lined with fresh tissue. He sets down the scalpel and takes up scissors and forceps, undermining the little flaps until each triangle is attached only at one side. He rotates each flap into its new position. He must be certain that they can be swung without tension. They can. He is ready to suture. He fits the tiny curved needle into the jaws of the needle holder. Each suture is placed precisely the same number of millimeters from the cut edge and the same distance apart. He ties each knot down until the edges are opposed, not too tightly. These are the most meticulous sutures of his life. He cuts each thread close to the knot. It goes well. The vermilion border with its white skin roll is exactly aligned. One more stitch in the cupid's bow appears as if by magic. The man's face shines with moisture. Now the nostrils incised around the margin, released and sutured into a round shape to match its mate. He wipes the blood from the face of the girl with gauze that he has dipped in water. Crumbs of light are scattered on the girl's face. The shroud is folded once more about her. The instruments are handed into the satchel. In a moment the morgue is dark, and the lone lantern ascends the stairs and is extinguished. 6 weeks later, I was in the darkened amphitheater of the medical school. Tiers of seats rose in a semicircle above the small stage where Hugh Franciscus stood presenting the case material he had encountered in Honduras. It was the highlight of the year. The hall was filled. The night before, he had arranged the slides in the order in which they were to be shown. I was at the control of the slide projector. Next slide, he would order from time to time in that military voice, which had called forth blind obedience from generations of medical students, interns, residents, and patients. This is a 57-year-old man with a severe burn contracture on the neck. You'll notice a rigid webbing that has fused the chin to the presternal tissues. No motion of the head on the torso is possible. Next slide. Click on the projector. Here he is after the excision of the scar tissue with the head in full extension for the first time. The defect was uncovered. Next slide. Click. With full thickness drums of skin taken from the abdomen with a pagid dermatome. Next slide. Click. And suddenly, there she was, extracted from the shadows, suspended above and beyond all of us like a resurrection. There was the oval face, the long black hair unbraided, the tiny gold hoops in her ears, and that luminous gnawed mouth. The whole of her life seemed to have been summed up in this photograph, a long silence photo that was the surgeon's alone to break. Almost at once, like the anesthesiast in the operating room in Comayagua, I knew that something was wrong. It was not that the man would not speak, as that he could not. The audience of doctors, nurses, and students seemed to have been infected by the black, limitless silence. My own pulse doubted it. It was hard to breathe. Why did he not call out for the next slide? Why did he not save himself? Why had he not removed the slide from the ones to be shown? All at once, I knew that he had used his camera on her again. I could see the long black shadows of her hair flowing into the darker shadows of the morgue. The sudden blinding flash. The next slide would be the one taken in the morgue. He would be exposed. In the dim light reflected from the slide, I saw him gazing up at her, seeing not the colored photograph, I thought, but the negative of where it were and the ghost of the girl was. For me, the amphitheater had become Honduras. I saw again the courtyard littered with patients. I could see the dust and the beam of light from the projector. It was then that I knew that was his measure of perfection and pain, the lost one, the other gained. He too had heard the click of the camera, had seen her wince and felt his mercy enlarge. At last he spoke. Imelda. It was the one word he had heard her say. At the sound of his voice, I removed the next slide from the projector. Click, and she was gone. Click, again, and in her place, the man with the orbital cancer. For a long moment, Franciscus looked up in my direction, on his face an expression that I had given up trying to interpret. Gratitude? Sorrow? It made me think of the gaze of the girl when at last she understood that she must hand over to him the evidence of her body. This is a 62-year-old man with a basal cell carcinoma in the temple eroding into the bony orbit. He began as though nothing had happened. At the end of the hour, even before the lights went on, there was a loud applause. I hurried to him, find among the parting crowd. I could not. Some weeks went by before I caught sight of him. He seemed vaguely convalescent, as though a fever had taken its toll before burning out. Hugh Franciscus continued to teach for 15 years, although he operated on a good deal less, then gave it up entirely. It was as though he had grown tired of blood, of always having to be involved with blood, of having to draw it, spill it, wipe it away, stanch it. He was a quieter, softer man, I heard. The ferocity diminished. There was no more expedition to Honduras or anywhere else. I, too, have not been entirely free of her. Now and then in the years that have passed, I see that donkey cart cortege, or his face bent over hers in the morgue. I would like to have told him what I now know, that his unrealistic act was one of goodness, one of those small, persevering acts done, perhaps to ward off madness, like lighting a lamp, boiling water for tea, washing a shirt, but of course, it's too late now.